We'll record to the cloud. Okay. So today we're joined by Mary Kummer and Jim McNall from ICRMP, which is the Idaho County Risk Management Program. Thanks for joining today.
Right, thank you.
Hi, thank you.
I usually start out by asking people to tell us a little bit about yourself so the students know who we're talking to. Mary, would you like to start? Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up at ICRMP.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Mary Kummer. I was born and raised North Dakota, which is why I talk funny. Have a little bit of a upper Midwest accent. Born and raised North Dakota, spent a little bit of time in the Seattle area, and then I moved over to Idaho and absolutely fell in love with everything that Idaho has to offer as far as the outdoors. My husband and I fish and camp and do outdoor activities, gardening and that kind of thing. And so this is a lovely place to live and a lovely place to work. ICRMP, Idaho County's Risk Management Program. I'm the marketing representative, assisting with members and member services here at ICRMP, and have been at ICRMP for over 12 years now, assisting local governments, cities, counties, highway districts, special purpose districts, most all of the Idaho local governments are members of ICRMP. They're not customers buying insurance, they're members of ICRMP that are members of the pool, and we provide property and liability insurance for Idaho local governments. And I have a marketing and public relations degree and have been able to work in those areas, marketing and PR, my whole adult life. So that's kind of cool and a statement that not everybody can say. So thank you for including us in this opportunity, Dr. Witt.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jim.
Okay, so I'm Jim McNall, ICRMP Risk Management Specialist. I have been with ICRMP for just over 27 years as an employee. And before that, I was actually on the board. I'm a recovering county commissioner. I was first elected 40 years ago now. So I was elected in 1980 initially. So I've been pretty much doing local government since then for 12 years as a county commissioner, and then a short break. And then after that, I was hired on at ICRMP to a job that I love, where I get to work with primarily local elected officials. My kind of area of expertise within ICRMP is I tend to do a lot of the governance training and answer those questions. So I deal with elected officials and appointed officials on things like open meeting, public records, conflict of interest, ethics, those basic governmental functions. So that's sort of my passion, and it's also my job.
Well, Jim, some of my students have been exposed to your work already, in that we've used material from your slides, from your trainings you do at ICRMP that you shared with me before in some of our ethics classes. So I know you've been making a huge impact, both of you and the organization, on local government officials for a long time. So appreciate your work on behalf of all those local government people.
Thank you.
I wanted to start with a really general question. What kinds of ethical problems, legal problems do we see in local governments in Idaho and nationally? What's the most common form of corruption and theft that you see?
So probably the most common is, and it's kind of a moving target because it's different than it was in the past. We don't see a lot of what we would normally think of as corruption in terms of, steering all the public funds to my aunt that then pays me back. Not that it doesn't happen, but we don't see that a lot. Probably one of the most common types of issues we deal with, and it can be fairly serious in terms of significant sums of money, is public employees, public elected officials, for the most part, not elected officials, but some of those as well, just sort of dipping into the till. Embezzlement is far more common than we would think, or at least than I would like to think. And because ICRMP provides property coverage that includes money, we end up paying those. So we have kind of a good idea of what goes on around the state when it comes to those kinds of issues. Also, we're seeing now cyber crime that may be done by sometimes employees oftentimes by outsiders that kind of suck employees into doing something that they shouldn't, maybe click on the wrong thing. And so we see that as an issue also.
So to add on to the embezzlement part of things, embezzlement and misuse of public funds. Examples that we have within Idaho local governments. We ran a report to show over the last 5 years in the crime coverage that Jim just mentioned in the ICRMP policy, what kinds of things fell in that category. An employee was using a city charge card for personal purposes. Another employee was using the petty cash and money that was around that some city halls and that kind of things have as a personal checking account. Another employee deposited a check intended for the entity into her personal account. Another employee paid out of the city account into his own account and writing a check to himself, but recording in the records that the check was written to a vendor. Or another instance, the employee did that and he voided the check. So it's like, it's these circumstances where, yeah, they're dipping into the till, they're embezzling, they're just taking the money, and falsifying timesheets is another thing that we think of as embezzlement, falsifying timesheets to pay themselves more money, because sometimes people, public employees, that get a paycheck from the public entity, again, we're talking local government or the level that we deal with, cities, counties, highway districts, special purpose districts, that kind of thing. Sometimes they miss out on a lot of family life because public business can take over based on what's happening. And there have been a couple of times, maybe more than a couple, but a couple of times where there's some indignation. They are mad at the entity, the public agency, for taking them away from their family. And so then to get what I felt like I was owed, they feel cheated, so they pad their timesheet so they get a little extra. It's the city or the county or the public entity's way of giving them a bonus without the entity even knowing that's happening. So that's another area that we would consider embezzlement and not appropriate.
Wow. Well, the students are familiar with the story in All the Queen's Horses, where the city clerk had created kind of a Ponzi scheme of creating fake accounts that no one else knew about and paying herself out of that. Is that the kind of thing that could happen in Idaho? I mean, have you seen similar instances?
We have, not necessarily the Ponzi scheme exactly like in that case, but we have seen, oftentimes it's some kind of a system that's developed by those who are in trusted positions, if you will. And we've actually had one that was very similar to that, where we had someone who was investing in quarter horses. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We've also see others, sometimes it's out of desperation. I know we've had some where we've had family members with health issues and they just felt desperate in doing that. A recurring theme is those who have a gambling addiction and they don't want to go home and tell their family that I just lost a bunch of money, so they take it out of a more convenient place that seems more comfortable. And unfortunately, that's a recurring theme is addictions to gambling. Horses, like I've had horses, so I know what an addiction they can be. And we've also seen, not as often as you might think, but substance abuse addictions that sometimes lead to that desperation.
I think I remember reading at one point, or maybe it was actually the professor in the film All the Queen's Horses. I can't remember where I got this now, that it's often your most trusted employee or the perfect employee who might be the person who might be committing these kinds of thefts or fraud. What do you think about that? Mary, you pointed like that rang a bell for you.
We internally, because we agree, we totally concur with that. We call that absolute trust, where it's a small shop, a small operation, a small governmental entity There's maybe the mayor and the person that does everything within City Hall or something like that. And they do it all because they've got such short or small staff. They wear a lot of hats. That's very normal, especially in rural Idaho. And yes, there's trust, of course. We hired them. They're good people. I know their family. And then there's some underlying causes of like what Jim just said, the gambling or shopping addiction or horses or whatever the reason. Absolute trust can definitely be a negative. And we have some thoughts on how to combat that.
So I wouldn't say that that's sometimes an issue. I would say, in my experience, that's almost always an issue.
Absolute trust.
In fact, I joke sometimes when I do some of the training about this, that, if you just hire people you didn't trust, get the criminal type, then you'll watch them like you should.
Watch them like a hawk.
That's not really what we want people to do, but the absolute trust causes a lack of oversight that should be built into the system.
So that oversight in our examples, we're using city clerks a lot. City clerk treasurers are often the same person in small rural governments. And I know from surveys I've done of the clerks in the Idaho City Clerk Treasurer Finance Officers Association that usually, in fact, they are one of two, maybe three people total that might work for a city in many cases. And according to my survey, many of them are covering as many as 25 different tasks related to, making the city run. So, so anyway, in that situation, there is supposed to be oversight, right, from the elected officials, the board, the council, the city council, and the mayor in this case. So that's usually present in most of our governmental systems, right? Where there's some kind of oversight that's supposed to happen.
Oh, no, in all of them, it's supposed to happen. Yes.
Yes. So checks and balances, very important. I think that's what we're talking about here. Checks and balances. And the lack of segregation of duties where the one person does it all. Stamps for deposit or signs and does and handles the money and then goes to the bank and deposits it and does it all. There is the lack of checks and balances right there that could occur. The accountability. We all act. There's something called the halo effect. We all act better when we think other people are watching. So even the mere fact of thinking that other people may be watching and having those systems in place, the checks and balances and some things in place can help reduce this risk of theft, embezzlement, corruption, that kind of thing, because other people are watching, whether they think they are or not.
And if you look at the statutes for pretty much any of the local units of government, but specifically for cities and counties, there's statutorily, there's a clerk and a treasurer that are kind of, do different functions. And like the city council meeting, you get a clerk's report of where we at with the budget. Then you get a treasurer's report of where we at with the checking account. Well, if the same person's doing both of those, which is often the case in smaller cities, and some cities that aren't so small even have that. And so that shifts the burden into the mayor and council to do more. But if I'm doing both reports, it's not too hard to make them balance. And that's one of the areas where we see some opportunity for improvement. Another theme that I hadn't really noticed until I reviewed the claims that Mary and I looked at for this presentation is there's a significant number of the issues where we've had something go wrong, where there was the mayor and the clerk, because that's often what it was in those agencies, had such a working relationship that the mayor kind of not covered up the crime, because the mayor, I don't think we've had any of those where the mayor was in on it, so to speak, but just basically protected the clerk treasurer position to where information that should have gone to the council to review was not provided to them. And so there's that breakdown as well. And we've seen that now numerous times.
So the motivation to protect the clerk is largely because they've been working so closely together, or
It gets to that absolute trust.
yeah.
How dare you as a council question anything that my employee, my friend would submit to you?
But let me see if I understand. Technically, the city council has to approve all expenditures by the city. Now, of course, in a large place like Boise, they're probably approving batches, but somebody is supposed to be combing through those, even if there are many, many of them, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So for example, here at ICRMP, Idaho County's Risk Management Program, we're a governmental agency, just like other local governments. So we follow, Jim and I as employees of ICRMP follow very closely what we need to do when we charge something onto the ICRMP credit card.
Mhm.
We turn in receipts, identify detailed receipts on what that purpose was for, what the purpose of the charge was for, explain it. If it was a lunch with a member, if it was a meeting and some supplies, we just very detailed what the purchase was for. We then, and this is monthly, we then combine our receipts and give them to the controller here at ICRMP, the finance person here at ICRMP. And then she reviews them from her perspective and sees if something is funky or wonky.
Right.
Then she gives them to the executive director. The executive director reviews them. Then the executive director and the controller then give them to one of the board members of ICRMP at the next ICRMP board meeting. We've got, now that may be a few too many layers, but erring on the side of caution, it's good to have a couple of layers in there to be able, I mean, again, the accountability, the checks and balances.
Well,
No
most
matter how trustworthy the person, the employee seems to be, it's good. Yeah.
and city council members and mayors in almost every Idaho city are volunteers who are not paid very much, if at all, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So they have full-time jobs and of course their families and other activities that they're doing. So I understand how we become so slack about the oversight of the employees, because you've got a good person, it's super complicated. You don't maybe understand all of everything the city does as a city council member. As you learn, you learn more, of course, but I can relate as a board member myself of the housing board here in Ada County that we had an amazing executive director, one of the best executive directors I've ever seen, but we probably should have been much more aggressive about, okay, that's a nice report. Now let's look at some original documentation and we can look at it. We never asked for that kind of thing. So I do understand how part-time citizen commissioners and council members and mayors can get into this kind of a situation where, and in fact, a large city can get into this kind of problem. As I recall, the problems in the city of Boise, boy, I don't know, what, 25 years ago now, were largely the result of the same kind of breakdown where nobody was investigating or double checking, in this case, the expenditures of the mayor and the chief of staff on things. And of course, it's tough when it's the leader of an organization who is doing something that might be questionable, because the people that are most likely to learn about that first are administrative level folks who may be frightened to take on the mayor or the chief of staff in that case.
And that's a common thing that we see is, something will happen and somebody says, well, I kind of had some suspicion about that, but I was afraid to tell anybody. And and probably there's some truth to why they would feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we talked about some of the reasons why the corruption and theft happens. Were there other reasons that you wanted to bring forward?
I think that kind of covers the reasons behind it. It's
Yeah.
often desperation, or I think I can get away with it.
One other addition, I guess. Sometimes it starts small. They
Mhm.
dip into petty cash to pay for something, a coffee, a whatever, and they're going to pay it back. And they do.
Yeah.
Well, that was easy. They do it again. Then
Yeah.
they do it again. And then do it a little bit larger. And it just spirals out of control. And that's how simple it can begin. It's just a few bucks borrowing, paying it back, and then the table is set.
Yeah, how much petty cash does a city really have laying around? I mean, I guess that's not that uncommon, right? People pay whatever to reserve the pagoda in the park or for the
Yeah,
kids' big team.
usually that's usually petty cash is smaller than that.
Mhm.
But but those kinds of things, what someone pays that's not a normal thing is an issue. And sometimes there's not the adequate checks on that. I remember this was probably 4 or 5 years ago around the state, we had a number of bad situations that resulted in the motor vehicle world because the state system, you couldn't balance it. And so all the assessors knew that, and they had, and the staff did. Unfortunately, there were several opportunities taken that were because of the system failure as well, because the checks and balances that were supposed to be built into the system didn't work. And of course, those that run the system knew that.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. What happens when, let's say the kind of embezzlement or theft of city money happens? What happens then if it comes to light? Then what happens?
Jim said it a minute ago, that some employees don't feel safe about reporting it or saying, something just felt weird about that. I'm not going to say anything. And it's that hesitancy that cannot uncover something. That had they not been hesitant, had they felt like they could go to their supervisor or the manager or the person they report to, and feel safe about reporting an observation. Not that they need to do anything with it or investigate or no, just sharing what an observation that just occurred. Having that safe environment to be able to do that, and knowing a process, like
Right.
as an employee or as a supervisor, knowing what to do when you get that kind of information. Having a process, whether that's a policy or a procedure or something like that at the agency, I think that's important.
Mhm.
So what happens to people is most of the time, prosecutors take this seriously. The legislature, years passed by quickly, but several years ago actually looked at the statutes dealing specifically with employee embezzlement from government employees, and they increased the penalties considerably. And so we see employees going to jail, paying fines. It's interesting, when that legislation was proposed, it was a senator from the Boise area who reached out to me because we interacted on some other things and said, I suspect that this happens around the state, but nobody has any information about it. I said, well, we do. So printed out a report similar to what Mary and I looked at and said, here's how many claims we have been involved in. And now we don't get involved in all of them. Some of them are less than the deductible that the members would pay. And so we don't see all of them, but my recollection was over a 5-year period, we had dealt with 35 different issues. Okay. And she said, that's a serious issue. The good news is the report that Mary and I looked at now had 30, but several of those were not employee. They were the outside hackers who had reached in and pulled money out of the till one way or another. So the numbers are less, but we see public employees going to jail. And if you look at the statute, for anyone who embezzles more than $300, the statute requires a minimum of a year in jail up to 14 years. So it's I tell our members, if you're going to steal from somebody, go knock off the 7-Eleven like everybody else, because the penalties are greater if you steal from the public agency.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't want them to go knock off the 7-Eleven. But the point is,
Yeah.
there are severe penalties, and we see prosecutors being really serious about this issue.
So cybercrime is an emerging area of concern. I don't want to say it's new; it's been going on for a while, but it's certainly emerging. Are some of these sort of that ransomware demand where the city's locked out of its information until they pay, or is it more where they're diverting money?
But that's in a totally different area. So an example of what we've seen in this report is the payroll department would get a request from an employee to change their direct deposit from one bank to another, only the employee didn't do it.
It wasn't
It
the
was an outside
employee.
person.
Yeah.
Or someone sends in, and this is one of the larger things, we had someone sent in a claim saying that appeared to be from a construction company that was actually doing work for this agency with significant billing, say, we've done this much work, please remit, and they did so electronically, only it went to somebody's bank account offshore. So we have seen those kinds of things, but we also see the cyber, what we normally refer to as the cyber claims, agencies locked out, someone clicked on something that they shouldn't. And it is not just getting your information back, but under the statute, there's a requirement to, notify people whose information may have been released. And in the case of government entities, that can be a significant number. You reside in the county and the assessor's data was breached. That's every taxpayer. So those are a different type of claim, but still something we see.
So you asked Dr. Witt, what should happen or what happened when these things were discovered?
Yeah.
Embarrassment, for one thing, on the payroll clerk example, where the bad guy, we'll just say, had pretended to be the public employee, emailed the payroll clerk and said, I'm changing banks, here's my new info, my new routing number, all of that kind of thing. And please change for the direct deposit stuff. It's tricky.
Nobody wants, first of all, I can't think of a more, other than protecting public safety, after that, protecting the public's money is the most important thing that as public officials we're supposed to do, right?
It's one of our responsibilities. Yeah. Right. And how embarrassing, not to mention the legal part of it and the employment part of it and all of those negatives that could come from it. It's just the first thing would be just like the payroll clerk and the report I read, again, to prepare for this session. She was so embarrassed that she fell for it.
Yeah.
So it's to stop, pause, take a moment, maybe just double check with the person directly, not responding to an email, but picking up the phone and calling the employee directly for people that are in those positions that are being asked to do those kinds of things. And just double checking, trust but verify.
Absolutely.
So this sounds like coming from someone who's old, but I'm old enough that I can actually say it. So much of this could be cured if we just talk to each other rather than communicating electronically.
Yeah, that's true. It's replaced a lot of face-to-face, like, why'd you decide to move banks, or something you might say in if they're handing you the paper, they want it, right? That's a lot different than an email that arrives. I know we have whistleblower protection statutes in Idaho as well as federally, but do you have a sense of how many cities have policies about the kinds of things Mary was talking about, like who do I report wrongdoing to and what are my options as a whistleblower?
Almost all of them have a personnel policy that includes that because they use our sample.
Yeah.
It doesn't go far enough, probably. We go into great detail. If someone's being sexually harassed, there's a lot of detail about what steps you should take, what the city should do, or the public agency. When it comes to whistleblower, certainly that's recognized as this is a protection you have. Please let us know. oftentimes it doesn't say, here's who you should report to. When I get the calls about that, I always recommend, include in that list your city attorney or your agency attorney, because people feel more comfortable talking to attorneys about these often than other coworkers.
Right.
And so we often see that again in the harassment discrimination world, not as frequently in the report other things that you see. So we have some work to do on that yet.
So
Yes.
from a policy standpoint, having guidelines, procedures, a policy in place to guide employees on what they should do when they observe something, or they actually see it, or it's happening and they're being affected, what the supervisors should do when they get this information reported, or just the next steps.
Right.
We're public employees as well, and we have policies for these things to guide Jim and me and the rest of the ICRMP staff on what we should do if we see this. So one policy we have is a code of ethics policy, separate from the personnel policy that goes into the harassment and whistleblower and those kinds of situations. The code of ethics policy, expectations of what we as public employees need to do and should do. The other policy that came to mind, again, in preparation for this conversation, ICRMP, we as ICRMP staff, employee travel and credit card use policy. Actual policy, a few pages long, but it guides us on what we can spend public dollars on, what we shouldn't spend public, never to use the company or the ICRMP credit card for personal gas, never for alcohol, never. And we see these policies, we review them, whether they've changed or not, we review them annually as ICRMP staff. Again, whether they've changed or not, and we train on them. So having a policy or procedure, training on it, and following it, I think are three important pieces to trying to mitigate or reduce things that can be done.
I think absolutely. And if it's even possible that there's a loop that closes to the evaluation process relative to those policies, I think that helps even more. Then you've got your ethics content from orientation through training to evaluation, and it becomes part of all the other processes at the organization, because I think we typically treat these kinds of issues like an inoculation, like you get one shot of it, once a year or something, and
now you're a good person for a year.
Yeah, and then it works.
Some of us are looking forward to soon. Yes.
Yes, I'm looking forward to some inoculations. So you've talked about some ways that ICRMP helps to fight these potential problems and corruption and embezzlement and theft and so on. What else are you doing? You do trainings. Do you want to talk a little bit about your set of actions you take to help elected officials?
With the sample policies that we have, I would say almost all of our members have personnel policies. Probably 90+% follow roughly our sample policy. So they have a lot of that in there. When it comes to the other policies, we might recommend them. They're going to be less common. We do training. We do a variety of training. Up until March of last year, we did a lot of training at conferences.
Yes.
The cities, we were routinely invited to do training at the cities, the city clerks and treasurers, the counties, some of their regional training opportunities, their district meetings, with the Highway Districts Association, the Idaho Rural Water Association. So we work, Fire Commissioners Association. So we work with a lot of associations, and we provide routinely training on this sort of an issue as part of that.
Yeah.
Also, we probably more I than anyone else do a lot of what we refer to as house call trainings. We'll get a call from a member saying, can you come and do training? Normally it's focused in a certain area, but I almost always manage to throw in a little bit of ethics training. I have one tomorrow with one of our member cities. It's going to be done remotely, which allows us to do it in these times, but that's going to be the focus is, what can you do and not do, and they're emphasizing one of the new statutes that deals with what can you ethically do when it comes to ballot initiatives, like a bond or supporting your favorite candidate. Well, there's some severe restrictions if you're a public employee about, you're always free to go out and on your own time, but you have to be really careful about using any resources, including employee time with that. So that's something we do training on a regular basis, and often sneak it in whether they want it or not. Ethics
is good to incorporate into most everything that we train on and that ICRMP helps members with.
I think that's true. I totally agree. I just want to loop back a little bit so the students are catching what you're saying there. That so, for example, a school district, it may have a bond issue that the voters will vote on. It takes a supermajority to pass those 66 2/3%. So the district is in some ways interested in getting a lot of people to vote yes, but it would be illegal for school district employees to advocate on behalf of that bond issue. Is that what you're saying?
While they're on the job.
While they're on the job.
For schools especially, that gets complicated because, most agencies have a few people that are kind of on the job all the time because we're paid exempt, we're paid a salary basis. So when are we on and off, that there's not a clear demarcation of that on or off duty. For teachers, they're always paid by statute. They're paid that way. So when are they on or off? They just have to be a little careful. I come from a family of teachers. But what really is prohibited is, using your position, advocating in the classroom. That would be clearly a violation of that statute.
Yep, understood. Well, I so appreciate your time here today. I wonder, is there anything we've left out or that you hoped to talk about that we didn't get to?
One other comment from an embezzlement and theft and that kind of thing. One other tip, annual audits.
Yeah.
Having someone from the outside, a third party, a CPA, an annual auditor come in and look at the books annually from just a third person point of view, and having that is something that we recommend strongly to our members.
So I have one thing to add, and that's for our members, something that we train on as well. That's when you have an open position, look carefully at the backgrounds of your applicants. We now have our second situation in which we had a public employee who was embezzled, and we ended up having a claim as a result of that, with the same person being hired by a neighbor public entity and now embezzling again.
Oh, no.
So
That's
at least talk to those who work with someone before you hire them. So the hiring process, I joked earlier about hire somebody who's not trustworthy. No, hire somebody who's trustworthy and check into that background. That's so critical. And that's more and more of a challenge because our especially smaller public agencies have a hard time attracting employees with any background in what they're doing. So if they have somebody who's been a clerk at a public agency, they're saying, boy, we're lucky to get somebody that knows, how to do it. And
right.
So there's a tendency to skip some of the steps, and we strongly encourage our members not to do that.
Absolutely. Well, that's great advice. And ICRMP and you guys are doing the work of the angels here. This is great. I'm glad that our local governments have you as a resource to go to. And as a taxpayer, of course, I'm delighted that there's a group helping our local governments learn how to do the public's business in the best way. Go ahead, please.
One thing I'd like to add is I reach out to really good sources for some of the information that I get. So I often, when I'm doing ethics training, I refer to something that I heard from Dr. Witt about don't look at ethics like you do your taxes. So I credit you with that when I'm doing those trainings, because that's a really good analogy.
Well, thanks. I don't know where I got that, but I've sure enjoyed that line. That's been a good one over the years.
Okay,
thank you for your time.
My Dr. Wittism,
Yeah.
your analogy of the levels of the house, basement being the legal lowest, but like the legal bare minimum basement. Now, how far up in the house do you want to go?
Yeah.
Anyway, I hope that if they haven't heard that you share that analogy with
Yep.
students.
It's in there. It's in some materials they'll get, so they'll see it again. It's so great to see you guys. I hope in the near future we're back to in-person conferences, which is
I
where
hope
I
so, yes.
get to see you guys a lot. And I appreciate your time and your expertise. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
You bet.